The galaxy had known about humans for 200 years, and in all that time, not a single species had ever found a reason to fear them. They were polite, almost painfully so, and every alien ambassador who had ever sat across a table from a human diplomat walked away with the same impression, that these were soft creatures from a soft world, who had somehow stumbled into the stars without any real understanding of how dangerous the universe could be. The Galactic Concord, a coalition of 43 elder species that had maintained peace for thousands of years, had welcomed humanity the way one might welcome a child into a room full of adults, with gentle smiles and low expectations, and the quiet assumption that the newcomers would need protecting sooner or later. And the humans had done nothing to change that impression. Their ambassadors spoke softly and smiled often, and apologized for things that were not their fault, and offered concessions before anyone even asked for them, and sent gifts on holidays they had no reason to celebrate, and wrote long letters of gratitude for the smallest gestures of kindness from other species. They were, by every measure the galaxy had, the most harmless civilization in recorded history. This was exactly what humanity wanted the galaxy to believe. 2 centuries earlier, when the first alien signal had reached Earth, and the people of that small blue world had realized they were not alone, there had been celebrations in the streets, and tears of joy, and speeches about unity and hope, and the dawn of a new age. But behind closed doors, in the deepest levels of the newly formed United Earth Council, a very different conversation was taking place. The scientists had analyzed the alien transmissions, and the data was clear. The galaxy was full of intelligent life, dozens of species spread across thousands of star systems, and none of them were anything like humans. Were old and wise and powerful in their own ways, but they had evolved on gentle worlds with stable climates and abundant resources, and very little reason to develop the one trait that had defined humanity since the first ape picked up a rock and realized it could be used to crack open a skull or break an enemy: violence. Humans were not just capable of violence, they were built for it, shaped by millions of years of evolution on a world that was constantly trying to kill them, a world of predators and plagues and ice ages and volcanic eruptions and mass extinctions, a world where the only way to survive was to be smarter and faster and more ruthless than everything else. The council looked at the data, and they looked at human history, and they looked at each other, and the room went very quiet. General Mara Singh, the first chair of the Terran Defense Initiative, was the one who finally spoke, and what she said would shape the course of human civilization for the next 200 years. "If they find out what we are," she said, "they will never stop being afraid of us. And afraid people do stupid things, so we make sure they never find out." The vote was unanimous. They called it Project Veil. Every record of human warfare was locked away behind encryption so dense that it would take an alien supercomputer 1,000 years to crack it. And every military installation was buried under layers of bureaucratic fiction. And the Terran Defense Initiative, the most powerful fighting force the galaxy had never seen, was officially listed in all public documents as the Terran Disaster Relief and Logistics Corps. The soldiers trained in secret, in hollowed-out asteroids and hidden stations deep in the void between stars. And the weapons scientists developed technologies that made the elder species' most advanced systems look like children's toys, and all of it was invisible. All of it was hidden behind the warm smiles, soft handshakes of humanity's diplomatic corps. And it worked. For 200 years, it worked beautifully. Humanity became the galaxy's favorite little brother, harmless and eager to please, and always ready to help, and never asking for anything in return. And the elder species patted them on the head and said kind things about their potential, and occasionally used them as an example of how even the most primitive civilizations could be uplifted if given enough time and patience. Nobody ever suspected the truth, because the truth was so outrageous that no one would have believed it, even if someone had told them. The most polite species in the galaxy was also the most dangerous thing the universe had ever produced. And then, the Vraxi came. The Vraxi Dominion was not part of the Galactic Concord, and they had no interest in peace or diplomacy or any of the other things that the elder species valued so highly. Because the Vraxi were conquerors. Tall, armored reptilian warriors who had built their empire by crushing every species that stood in their way and enslaving the ones that survived. They had been expanding for centuries, swallowing smaller civilizations whole, and now their borders had finally reached the edges of human-controlled space. The first attack was small, 3 colonial outposts on the frontier, mining stations with minimal population, hit fast and hard by Vraxi raider ships that appeared out of nowhere and vanished before anyone could respond. 42 humans died in those raids. On any other world in the galaxy, this would have been a crisis. But the humans did what humans always did. They sent a message. It was polite, as all human messages were, written in the formal diplomatic language of the Concord, and addressed to the Vraxi High Command, with all the proper titles and honorifics. And it said, in the gentlest possible terms, that humanity would very much appreciate it if the Vraxi would please stop attacking their colonies and perhaps consider opening a dialogue so that the two civilizations could find a peaceful resolution to whatever misunderstanding had led to this unfortunate situation. The Vraxi ambassador, a scarred old warrior named Dren Cole, read the message out loud to the Vraxi War Council, and the entire room erupted in laughter. Warlord Kreth Vaughn, Supreme Commander of the Vraxi Dominion and the most feared military mind in 3 sectors, laughed hardest of all. "The soft mammals beg," he said, and he ordered the message broadcast on every channel in the galaxy, so that everyone could see how the weak little humans had crawled on their bellies and pleaded for mercy. The broadcast played on stations across 1,000 worlds, and alien species of every kind watched it and shook their heads sadly and wondered how long it would be before the humans were conquered entirely. Nobody, not the Vraxi, not the Concord, not a single living soul in the entire galaxy had any idea what was coming. Because the humans had not been begging. They had been giving. Warning 1. 6 weeks passed after the first raids, and the galaxy moved on because that is what the galaxy always did. It moved on from small tragedies the way a river moves around a stone, barely noticing the disruption before continuing on its way. But the Vraxi did not move on. They had tasted human space and found it soft and undefended and full of resources, and Warlord Kreth Vaughn was not the kind of leader who tasted something sweet and then walked away from the table. He wanted more. The target he chose was Elysium 4, a human agricultural colony on the edge of contested space. A green and peaceful world where 11,000 men and women and children grew food that fed a dozen other colonies. A world with no military presence at all, because the humans had never officially admitted to having a military presence anywhere. The Vraxi fleet arrived at dawn. 12 warships dropped out of hyperspace above Elysium 4 and began their bombardment without warning, without demands, without even the pretense of a reason, because the Vraxi did not need reasons. They had power, and power was the only reason that mattered. The colony never had a chance. The orbital strikes turned farmland into glass, and houses into ash, and rivers into steam. And when it was over, the Vraxi recorded everything. Every burning field, every shattered building, every lifeless body. And they broadcast it across the galaxy with a message stamped across the bottom of the screen in bold alien script. This is what happens when prey forgets its place. 11,000 humans died on Elysium 4, and the galaxy watched it happen in real time on their screens and monitors and holographic displays. And the reaction was what it always was when something terrible happened to someone who was not powerful enough to fight back. Sadness and sympathy and strongly worded statements of concern that meant absolutely nothing. An emergency session, and several elder species gave long speeches about the tragedy of war and the importance of dialogue. And then they sent a private message to Earth, suggesting, in the kindest possible terms, that perhaps humanity should simply give the Vraxi what they wanted. The Vraxi are warriors, the message said, and you are diplomats, and it is the natural order of things for the strong to take from the weak, and perhaps it would be better for everyone if you simply ceded the border territories and avoided further bloodshed. The humans read that message, and for the first time in 200 years, the people in the deepest rooms of the United Earth Council felt something that Project Veil had been designed to prevent the galaxy from ever seeing. Anger. Not the hot and reckless anger that burns fast and fades faster, but the cold and patient anger that sits in the chest like a block of ice and does not melt and does not move. Forget Admiral Raya Chen, the current commander of the Terran Defense Initiative, stood before the council and said nothing for a very long time. And then she said just 5 words. We send warning 2, then we prepare. The second message was transmitted to the Vraxi High Command the following morning. It was different from the first one, and anyone paying close attention would have noticed the change immediately. The warm language was gone, the diplomatic softness had been stripped away, and what remained was something precise and clean and cold, like a scalpel laid out on a steel tray. The message acknowledged the attack on Elysium 4, and stated that humanity considered this an act of war, and requested an immediate ceasefire and full reparations for the families of the dead. And then, at the very bottom, there was a line that no human diplomatic communication had ever contained before. This is formal warning 2 of 3. We urge the Vraxi Dominion to reconsider its current course of action. We will not issue a 4th warning. Warlord Kreth Von read the message in his command chamber aboard the Vraxi flagship Ironclaw, and he smiled the way a predator smiles when it sees something small trying to look big. And he tore the message from the screen and pinned it to the wall beside his trophy collection of conquered flags and broken weapons. 2 of 3, he said to his generals, and they all laughed, because the idea of the soft little humans counting out warnings like a parent scolding a child was the funniest thing any of them had heard in years. Let them send their 3rd warning, Kreth Von said, and then we will send our reply with fire. He did not know that the warning system was not a bluff, and it was not a negotiation tactic, and it was not desperation dressed up in formal language. It was a countdown, and while the Vraxi laughed and planned their next assault, something was happening in human space that no alien sensor network detected, because no alien sensor network was built to detect something that was not supposed to exist. Across 100 hidden stations buried in asteroid fields and gas giant atmospheres and the dark spaces between stars, the Terran Defense Initiative was waking up. Ships that had been listed as cargo haulers in every public database shed their false hulls and revealed what lay underneath. Sleek and angular warships bristling with weapons that operated on principles the galaxy's best scientists had never even theorized. Powered by engines that could bend the fabric of space in ways that the elder species physics said were impossible. Soldiers who had spent their entire careers training in secret, who had run combat simulations 10,000 times and mastered every form of warfare that humanity's long and bloody history had ever invented, received a single coded transmission on their private channels. Veil Protocol. Amber. Stand ready. 12 fleets, each one larger than the combined military forces of most Concord species, moved into staging positions across human space, like wolves circling a campfire, silent and invisible and patient. And in a small intelligence office on a Concord monitoring station, a 4-armed insectoid analyst named Thyrus was staring at her screen with all 4 of her hands trembling. She had been tracking routine energy signatures in human space, a boring assignment that nobody wanted, because human space was the most boring sector in the galaxy, when she noticed something wrong. The energy readings did not match the public records. The public records said humanity had 200 light patrol craft and a handful of transport ships. but her instruments were showing energy signatures consistent with thousands of combat-grade vessels, and the power output she was detecting was so far beyond anything she had ever seen that she checked her equipment 3 times before she believed her own data. She filed an urgent report with her superiors at the Concord Intelligence Bureau. They read it, and they dismissed it in less than a minute. "It is the humans, Thyris," her commanding officer said, with the tired patience of someone explaining something obvious to a child. "They probably have a sensor malfunction, or perhaps they are running some kind of agricultural equipment that is giving off unusual readings. It is always something mundane with the humans." Thyris wanted to argue, wanted to scream that the numbers were not mundane, that what she was seeing was impossible, unless humanity had been lying about everything for 200 years. But she was a junior analyst, and her commanding officer was a senior official who had been studying the galaxy for longer than Thyris had been alive. And so she said nothing. She just saved the data and waited. And far away, in the cold silence of space, 12 human fleets waited with her. Haven Station was not a military target by any definition that any civilized species had ever used. It was a medical facility, a sprawling orbital hospital that floated in neutral space and opened its doors to anyone who needed help, human or alien, rich or poor, friend or stranger. It did not matter, because Haven Station had been built on a single principle that humanity had carried with them from Earth, like a torch in the dark. Everyone deserves care. The doctors and nurses who worked there had treated Vraxi soldiers before, had stitched their wounds and set their broken bones, and never once asked what side of any conflict they were on, because that was not what healers did. And the station had become a symbol across the galaxy of everything the elder species believed about humanity, that they were kind and gentle and good, and perhaps a little naive, but ultimately the best version of what a young species could be. The Vraxi attacked Haven Station on a Tuesday. They did not attack it because it had strategic value, because it did not. And they did not attack it because it posed a threat, because it could not. And they did not attack it because they had any military reason at all. They attacked it because Warlord Kreth Vaughn wanted to send a message, and the message was simple. Nothing human was safe, not even the things that helped other species, not even the things that the galaxy loved. The assault was brutal and deliberate, and designed for maximum horror. Vraxi boarding parties stormed the station, with weapons drawn, and cut through the minimal security in minutes. And then they moved through the corridors, ward by ward, and they killed everyone they found. Doctors who raised their hands in surrender, nurses who tried to shield their patients, patients who could not move from their beds, and in the pediatric wing, where the youngest and most vulnerable patients were being treated, they killed the children. They recorded everything. They broadcasted live across every channel they could reach, and the galaxy watched in real time as armored Vraxi soldiers dragged the bodies of human medical staff into the main atrium and strung them from the ceiling like decorations, and the camera lingered on their faces so that everyone could see who they had been before they became a warning. The broadcast ended with Kreth Vaughn's face filling the screen, his reptilian eyes bright with triumph, his voice carrying the absolute confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable. "Let this be the end of the humans' foolish warnings," he said. "The prey does not warn the hunter." Then the signal cut, and Earth went silent. It happened all at once, like someone had flipped the switch. Every human embassy in the galaxy stopped responding to communications. Every human trade ship returned to port. Every human diplomat left their assigned station and went home. Channel and frequency and communication relay that humanity operated went dark. For 3 galactic standard days, there was nothing. No messages, no explanations, no apologies, no pleas, no diplomatic notes, no trade offers, no cultural exchanges, no scientific collaborations, no humanitarian aid shipments, no medical supply deliveries, no response to any signal from any species for any reason. The galaxy noticed immediately, because humanity had woven itself so deeply into the daily functioning of interstellar civilization that their sudden absence was like a missing heartbeat. Trade routes went unserviced, joint research projects stalled, medical supplies that dozens of alien worlds depended on stopped arriving, and diplomatic channels that had been open for 2 centuries went cold. The elder species sent inquiries and received nothing back, and for the first time in 200 years, they felt something unfamiliar when they thought about the humans. Unease. On the 4th day, the silence broke. Every human installation in the galaxy transmitted simultaneously. Every embassy, every station, every ship, every relay, every satellite, every probe, all of them, broadcasting on every frequency in every known language at the same time, so that there was nowhere in the galaxy where the message could not be heard. It was not from a diplomat. It was from Admiral Raya Chen, commander of the Terran Defense Initiative, and most of the galaxy had never heard that title before, because it was not supposed to exist, because the Terran Defense Initiative was officially the Terran Disaster Relief and Logistics Corps, and disaster relief coordinators did not hold the rank of admiral. Her voice was calm and clear and completely empty of emotion, like a surgeon describing a procedure, like a mathematician reading an equation, like someone who had moved past anger into something much colder and much more focused. The message was 4 words. This is Warning 3. There was no greeting and no diplomatic language and no formal structure and no pleasantries and no request for dialogue and no suggestion of peaceful resolution and no expression of hope that cooler heads would prevail. Just 4 words and a data file. The data file was attached to the transmission, and it was unencrypted, which meant anyone in the galaxy could open it. And within minutes, every intelligence agency and military command and scientific institution in the Concord had done exactly that. The file contained the real military census of humanity. Not the public version that listed 200 patrol craft and a logistics corps, but the actual classified inventory that had been hidden behind Project Veil for 2 centuries. The true number of warships, the true capabilities of their weapon systems, the true scope of their defensive networks, the true depth of their military doctrine, the true count of their trained combat personnel. Phyrus was the first Concord analyst to finish reading it, and when she did, she pushed back from her desk and sat very still for a long time, because her mind was trying to process numbers that should not have been possible. She requested an emergency session of the full Galactic Concord, and when the representatives of 43 elder species gathered in the Great Chamber and looked at her expectantly, she did not give them a long briefing, or a detailed analysis, or a carefully worded assessment. She gave them 3 sentences. They have more warships than all of us combined. Their weapons operate on principles we do not have theories for. They have been hiding everything. The chamber erupted into chaos. Species that had treated humanity like children for 200 years were suddenly realizing that the children had been carrying weapons the entire time and had simply chosen not to show them. And the fear that Project Veil had been designed to prevent was finally here. 2 centuries late, but twice as powerful, because it came with the understanding that humanity had been capable of this level of destruction the entire time, and had never once used it. The Vraxi received the same file. Warlord Kreth Von read it in his command chamber aboard the Ironclaw, and for the first time since the war began, he did not laugh. His generals looked at the numbers, and several of them suggested that perhaps it was time to reconsider the campaign against humanity. And Kreth Von turned on them with fury in his eyes, because he was a conqueror, and conquerors did not retreat, and conquerors did not show fear, and conquerors certainly did not back down because of a data file that was probably a fabrication designed to frighten them. "It is a bluff," he declared. "The humans are desperate, and this is their last trick. They cannot fight, they have never fought, they do not know how to fight, and we will prove it by burning their homeworld to ash. He ordered his entire armada, 4,000 warships, the largest Vraxi fleet ever assembled, to converge on the Sol system, on Earth itself, on the soft blue world where this soft species had been born. The Vraxi armada jumped into the Sol system at exactly 1400 hours Galactic Standard Time, and for the first 3 seconds after arrival, Warlord Kreth Vaughn felt the fierce joy of a predator closing in on its kill. 4,000 warships arranged in the classic Vraxi assault formation, a massive arrowhead designed to punch through any defense and deliver overwhelming firepower to a single point. And ahead of them, the pale blue marble of Earth, hanging in the dark like a jewel waiting to be taken. Then the sensors updated, and the joy died. The Terran Second Fleet was waiting for them, and it was not hiding, and it was not running, and it was not small. 12,000 warships filled the space between the Vraxi armada and Earth, arranged in a formation that no Vraxi tactical officer recognized, because it did not exist in any military database in the galaxy. A layered sphere that shifted and rippled like a living thing, every ship in constant motion. Motion, every angle covered, every possible attack vector accounted for before the Vraxi had even finished arriving. Kreth Vaughn stared at the sensor readings, and his jaw tightened, because the numbers were worse than the data file had suggested. The Second Fleet alone outnumbered his entire armada, 3-1, and according to the file, the Second Fleet was the smallest of humanity's 12 fleets. His first officer, a veteran named Shar Kal, turned to him with something in her eyes that Kreth Vaughn had never seen in a Vraxi officer before. Fear. "Warlord," she said, "We attack," Kreth Vaughn said, because he was Vraxi, and the Vraxi did not retreat. Not ever, not from anyone, and certainly not from a species that had spent 2 centuries smiling and bowing and apologizing. The Vraxi armada surged forward, and the Battle of Sol began. It lasted 9 hours, and calling it a battle was generous, because a battle implies that both sides have a chance of winning. And the Vraxi never had a chance, not for a single second, not from the very first moment the first weapon was fired. The human ships moved like nothing the Vraxi had ever seen, or imagined, or dreamed of in their worst nightmares. They did not fly in straight lines or predictable arcs, the way every other ship in the galaxy did. They danced, sliding between Vraxi formations like water through fingers, appearing where they should not have been, and vanishing from where they were supposed to be. Their movements so fast and so precise that the Vraxi targeting computers could not keep up, because the computers were programmed for physics that these ships did not seem to obey. The human weapons were worse. Vraxi shields, which had held against every weapon system in the galaxy for 300 years, collapsed on first contact with human energy beams, like soap bubbles hit by a hurricane. And the beams did not destroy the ships they hit, disabled them, cutting through hull and armor with surgical precision to sever power conduits and engine cores and weapon systems, while leaving life support and structural integrity completely intact. Every shot was perfect, and every shot was deliberate, and every shot was designed to stop a ship from fighting without killing the people inside it. Kreth Vaughn watched from his command bridge as his fleet was taken apart piece by piece, and he could not understand what he was seeing because it did not make sense. The humans were winning. They were winning so completely and so effortlessly that it was almost casual, and yet they were not killing anyone. A Vraxi dreadnought, the Worldbreaker, the largest and most powerful ship in the Armada, made a desperate charge directly at the human carrier at the center of the formation, a last act of defiance, a kamikaze run designed to take at least one human ship down with it. The carrier sidestepped. It moved sideways, at faster-than-light speed, a maneuver that every physicist in the galaxy had declared to be physically impossible, and it moved so smoothly and so casually that it looked less like an emergency dodge and more like a person stepping out of the way of a child running down a hallway. The world breaker sailed past the empty space where the carrier had been, and was immediately disabled by 6 precision strikes from ships it never even detected. 9 hours after it began, the battle was over. 4,000 Vraxi warships drifted in the void around Earth, every single one of them disabled, not one of them destroyed, their crews alive and their life support functioning, and their escape pods unharmed, because not a single human weapon had targeted a single escape pod during the entire engagement. The silence that followed was the loudest thing the galaxy had ever heard. Admiral Rhea Chen opened a communication channel to the Vraxi flagship, Ironclaw, which was dark, powerless, and drifting slowly in the shadow of Earth's moon. And her face appeared on Kreth Vaughn's emergency backup screen. A small, calm human woman with dark hair pulled back tight, and eyes that held no anger, and no triumph, and no satisfaction. Only a steady and absolute patience that was somehow more terrifying than any weapon he had just witnessed. "Warlord Vaughn," she said, and her voice was the same voice that had delivered Warning 3, calm and clear and completely without emotion. "Your fleet is disabled, and your soldiers are alive, and this was a courtesy." She paused, and in that pause Kreth Vaughn felt something he had never felt before in his entire life, something that no enemy had ever made him feel, something that went deeper than fear and deeper than humiliation, and settled into his bones like cold water. He felt small. "You have one standard day," Admiral Chen continued, "to agree to unconditional ceasefire, the return of all human remains from Haven Station, and full reparations to the families of every person your forces killed. If you do not comply, we will stop being courteous." The channel closed. Across the galaxy, the battle footage leaked within hours, because there were Concord observation posts in nearby systems, and their sensors had captured everything, and within a day, every species in the galaxy had watched the Vraxi Armada, the most feared military force in 3 sectors, get dismantled like a toy by a species that most of them had considered helpless. The Galactic Concord descended into a state of panic that made their previous chaos look like a mild disagreement. Species that had patronized humanity for 2 centuries were suddenly going back through every interaction they had ever had with a human, and rereading every word with new eyes, and what they found terrified them. The politeness had not been weakness, the concessions had not been desperation, the smiles had not been submission. All of it had been a choice, made by a species that could have crushed any of them at any time, and had simply decided not to. Phyrus broadcast a message to the full Concord from her small intelligence office, and her voice was steady, even though all 4 of her hands were shaking. "They were never pretending to be peaceful," she said. "They were pretending to be incapable. There is a profound difference." The words hung in the air of the great chamber like smoke, and 43 elder species sat in silence, because there was nothing to say. They had spent 200 years believing they understood humanity. They had not understood anything at all. The deadline came and went, and Kreth Vaughn did not respond. It was not because of pride, though he had plenty of that, and it was not because of defiance, though every Vraxi bone in his body screamed at him to spit in the face of the human admiral and die with honor. It was because his communications array had been destroyed in the battle, and he physically could not transmit a reply. And his backup systems were running on emergency power that was barely enough to keep the lights on. And every technician on his ship was working desperately to repair something, anything, that would let him send even a single word back to the humans. Admiral Rhea Chen did not know this, but she suspected it. When the 24-hour deadline passed, she was standing on the bridge of the Terran carrier Resolute, and her officers looked at her and waited for the order that they all knew was coming, the order to escalate, the order to stop being courteous. said nothing at all. Then she checked the time and added 6 more hours to the clock. Their communications might be down, she said. We hit them pretty hard. Her executive officer, Commander David Osei, stared at her. Admiral, he said carefully, they killed children at Haven Station. I know, Chen said, and something moved behind her eyes, something vast and dark and old. But she held it in place, the way 2 centuries of human discipline had taught her to hold it, and she kept her voice even. But we do not become what they are just because they made us angry. Give them the extra time. She paused. We are courteous, she said. That is not the part that was fake. The 6 hours passed. No response came from the Iron Claw. At exactly 30 hours after the original deadline, Admiral Chen gave the order, and the Terran First Fleet jumped. The First Fleet was not the Second Fleet. The Second Fleet had been the smallest of humanity's 12 fleets, a screening force, a defensive line. The fleet you sent when you wanted to make a point without making a mess. The First Fleet was something else entirely. It was the hammer, the closed fist, the thing that humanity had built in the darkest and most honest hours of Project Veil. When the engineers and the generals had sat down together and asked themselves a question that no one else in the galaxy had the imagination to ask. What would it take to end a war in a single day? The First Fleet jumped directly into Vraxi home space, into the heart of the Dominion, into orbit around the Vraxi homeworld itself. And the Vraxi Home Defense Force, 300 ships that had been considered the most formidable defensive array in their sector, looked up at the armada that had appeared above their world, and understood immediately that fighting was not an option. The First Fleet did not fire on the homeworld. Population. They did not demand surrender with weapons aimed at civilian centers. Instead, with the same surgical precision that had defined the Battle of Sol, they began to dismantle the Vraxi war machine. Every orbital defense platform was disabled. Every weapon satellite was shut down. Every shipyard was carefully and methodically taken apart. Every military factory on the surface was targeted with strikes so precise that buildings across the street were untouched. Every ammunition depot was neutralized. Every full reserve was drained. Every command center was blinded. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes to erase 300 years of Vraxi military buildup. And when it was done, the Vraxi homeworld was completely intact. The cities were standing. The infrastructure was functioning. The hospitals were running. The schools were open. The farms were producing. The people were alive. Every single one of them. 0 civilian casualties. Not one. Not a rounding error. Not an acceptable loss. Not a regrettable but necessary consequence. Not a single life that was not holding a weapon. The galaxy would later learn that the First Fleet had spent 11 years planning this specific operation, running simulations millions of times, mapping every building on the Vraxi homeworld, identifying every civilian structure, calculating every angle of every strike to ensure that the margin of error was not small, but literally non-existent. This was what humanity had been doing for 200 years behind the veil. Not just building weapons, but building the ability to use those weapons without becoming monsters. Kreth Vaughn surrendered from the bridge of the Iron Claw, which had finally managed to restore basic communications, just in time to receive word that his empire's entire military capability had been erased in less time than it took to eat a meal. He transmitted his surrender in a voice that was hollow and broken, not because he had lost a war. Vraxi had lost wars before and come back stronger, but because he had finally understood something that changed the shape of his entire worldview. The humans had not been weak. They had been strong enough to choose gentleness, and that was a kind of strength that the Vraxi had no word for. 3 months later, the Galactic Concord convened the most important summit in its history, and for the first time, humanity did not send only diplomats. The delegation that walked into the Great Chamber was something the galaxy had never seen. Ambassador Elias Okonkwo, in his formal diplomatic robes, walking side by side with Admiral Raya Chen in her military dress uniform. and behind them a mixed group of diplomats and officers. The two halves of humanity that had been kept separate for 2 centuries, now standing together in the open for the first time. The chamber was silent as Okonkwo took the podium. Every species leaned forward because they all wanted to understand. They all needed to understand how they had been so wrong for so long. Okonkwo looked out at the faces of 43 species, and he smiled. That same warm, open, disarming human smile that the galaxy had seen 1,000,000 times, and had always interpreted as the smile of a species that did not know any better. 2 centuries ago, he said, we looked at the galaxy and we made a choice. We knew what we were. We knew what our history had made us. We knew what we were capable of. And we decided that the galaxy deserved better than to meet us at our worst. He paused and let the words settle. Every act of diplomacy was real. Every concession was real. Every smile was real. Every time we chose patience over power, that choice was real. Our kindness was never the mask. His voice grew quieter, and the translators across the chamber adjusted to match. Our restraint was the mask. Kindness was always genuine. We simply chose every single day to be better than our nature demanded. We would like to continue doing so. Another pause, and when he spoke again, his voice was steady and clear and carried to every corner of the chamber. But we will no longer pretend that we do not have teeth. The Concord voted unanimously to grant humanity a permanent seat on the High Council, and every species in the room voted yes for the same unspoken reason. It was better to have the humans smiling at you from across a table than to give them any reason to stop. The galaxy changed after that, slowly and then all at once. And humanity took its place not as the galaxy's little brother, but as something new, something that had no precedent in galactic history. A species that was both the most dangerous and the most gentle, the most capable of destruction and the most committed to peace. A contradiction that the elder species spent decades trying to understand. And never fully could. Months after the summit, Phyrus visited the human embassy on the Concord station. A small, bright space filled with plants and soft lighting that looked exactly the same as it had before the war. Because the humans had not changed anything about it. She found Ambassador Okonkwo in a small garden at the back of the embassy, kneeling in the soil, tending to flowers that he had brought from Earth. Real flowers, not synthetic, because he said they grew better when you talked to them, and he liked having someone to talk to. Phyrus stood beside him and watched him work with her forearms folded. And after a while, she asked him the question that had been sitting inside her since the day she first opened that military census file. Were you ever afraid, she asked, that the galaxy would find out what you really were? Okonkwo sat back on his heels and looked up at her, and he smiled. That same human smile. And now she understood that it had never been simple. That it carried the weight of 2 centuries of choices and sacrifices, and the constant daily effort of a species holding itself back from the edge of what it could do. Every single day, he said. But that is what separates us from monsters, Phyrus. Monsters are not afraid of what they might do. We were always terrified. That is why we built the veil in the first place. He turned back to his flowers and pressed his fingers gently into the soil, and Phyrus watched him and thought about everything she had learned about humans in the past year. The violence and the kindness, the weapons and the flowers, the teeth and the smile. And she realized something that she suspected the elder species would spend centuries arguing about. The most dangerous species in the galaxy was also the most kind, and those two things were not contradictions. They were the same thing, because kindness without the power to do otherwise is just helplessness. Power without the choice to be kind is just cruelty. And what the humans had, what they had always had, was both, held together in a balance so delicate and so deliberate that it required every ounce of strength they possessed just to maintain it. And they maintained it anyway, every single day. That was what made them human.